Hi, everyone, and welcome. Good afternoon, Noam, and good morning, everyone. My name is Leonard. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you here. Today marks the second talk of Innovation in Linguistics by Cognitive Semantics, and we are very honored to have Noam Chomsky with us. So without further ado, I'd like to invite the organizer of today's event, also the founding editor and editor-in-chief of Cognitive Semantics, Professor Fuyin Thomas Lee, to introduce the event for us. Welcome.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Professor Chomsky. That is for you, good afternoon. So I'm extremely honored to introduce the speaker today, Professor Noam Chomsky. So to make sure everybody can see it, especially for the students who can follow, I share my screen. Hi, Selena, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. First, there is a general puzzlement from the audience. So in the past few days, I've been frequently asked, why do you invite Professor Chomsky? And why does Cognitive Semantics invite Professor Chomsky? Now first, before I introduce Professor Chomsky, I explain the puzzlement. In fact, the journal Cognitive Semantics takes the relationship between meaning and mind as its central concern. But unfortunately, a great contribution from generative grammar is missing from the journal. That's why we need initiate this talk. So I introduce Professor Chomsky. Professor Chomsky, I can't see my screen, okay. Professor Chomsky is the founder of modern linguistics. He is one of the most cited scholars in modern history. Among his groundbreaking books, as you know, are Syntactic Structures, Language in the Mind, Aspect of the Theory of Syntax, the Minimalist Program, each of which has made a distinct contribution to the development of the field. Professor Chomsky has received numerous awards, including the Kyoto Prize in Basic Sciences. This is the Japan equivalent to Nobel Prize. The Helmholtz Medal and the Ben Franklin Medal in Computer and Cognitive Science. Professor Chomsky introduced the Chomsky hierarchy, generative grammar, and the concept of a universal grammar, which underlies all human speech and is based in the innate structure of the mind and the brain. Professor Chomsky has not only transformed the field of linguistics, his work has influenced fields such as cognitive science, philosophy, psychology, computer science, mathematics, childhood education, and anthropology. Professor Chomsky is also one of the most influential public intellectuals in the world. He has written more than 100 books, his most recent being Requiem for the American Dream, the 10 Principles of Concentration, of Wealth, and Power. Professor Chomsky joined the University of Arizona in fall 2017, coming from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, that is MIT, where he worked since 1955. And Professor Chomsky was Institute Professor and later Institute Professor Emeritus. Professor Chomsky's research interests include linguistic theory, syntax, semantics, philosophy of language. And here we have a complete list of articles, which I will distribute to the audience later, and another complete list of books, over 100 titles books. Professor Chomsky very kindly hosted me as his visiting scholar some 10 years ago. And I noticed there was a thick pile of invitations on his table. So today, I feel very proud I can invite Professor Chomsky to talk to us. So let us welcome Professor Chomsky. Now, Professor Chomsky, you have the microphone and have the whole audience and have the whole floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you vicariously. I did give a lecture at Beijing University some years ago in person. I have not yet been able to return. Time is brief. There's a lot I would like to cover, so I'll have to keep to a sketchy and rather informal account. Then I'll turn to the very interesting set of questions that were submitted, and I hope we can have some discussion about them. Well, the long-term goal of theoretical inquiry is explanation, which is not a trivial concept. I'll try to clarify as we proceed. We can begin by distinguishing explanation from description. Descriptive inquiries seek to show that this is the way things are. Explanation goes far beyond. It seeks to show why things are this way and not some other way. It's a much more ambitious endeavor, but it is the goal to keep in mind. Now, there are ways in which description can lead to explanation. That can happen if there's a definite method that leads to the description. One can then inquire into how that method fares in other cases. Kind of explanation. One example of that is structural linguistics, which developed procedures of analysis that could be applied to any corpus of linguistic materials. We can therefore test the procedures on possible and impossible languages. If they make the distinction properly, they would approach answers to the deeper why questions. It can, however, easily be shown that the procedures work just as well for impossible as for possible languages, and therefore they tell us virtually nothing about language. Now, that was not a problem at the time, because it was assumed that languages could vary virtually without limit and were acquired by training or more narrowly by conditioning. So there are no impossible languages. Actually, that made sense within the prevailing behaviorist framework of the day. In linguistics, the basic principle, quoting Leonard Bloomfield, most prominent American structural linguistics, for him, language is a matter of training and habit. Same for other leading linguists, Charles Hackett, many others. In philosophy, in the same years, the dominant idea was that language is a complex of dispositions established by conditioning. It's quoting W.V. Quine, the most prominent American philosopher of language and mind, and there are other variants which are similar. Well, it's by now been well established that none of this can be sustained. There is actually a contemporary analog. You can read about it in the newspapers all the time. It's the enthusiasm for deep learning, like the state-of-the-art GPT-3 system of language processing that makes headlines because it can produce text that looks like actual language. Actually, you may have seen an excited lead story in the New York Times Magazine a couple of weeks ago, proclaiming that for the first time, machines can speak just like humans. They were referring to the state-of-the-art system, GPT-3. Well, we can raise the same question. How does the system fare with impossible languages? The answer is the same. It does just as well or better with systems that violate the principles of language. Therefore, this multi-million-dollar deep learning neural network trained on a 45 terabyte corpus of text and running on the world's largest supercomputers is telling us nothing about language. And a fair question is whether it's doing anything apart from using a lot of California's energy. The next installment, GPT-4, which features 100 trillion parameters, will use even more energy and tell us just as much about language, 0. This morning, you can read similar awed excitement about how Google's Lambda system may actually have achieved sentience, become consciously aware. It's another joke for the same reasons. I won't pursue the point, but along the same lines, we can show that virtually all of the popular approaches to description of language fail radically in the same way. Won't pursue it, but it's a matter worth some thought. Well, in the case of language, inquiry proceeds at 2 levels. One level is concerned with individual languages. The second and higher level is concerned with the general faculty of language. Let's call it FL for short. FL is the innate endowment that enables a language to be acquired and used. At the first level, study of individual languages, inquiry seeks the grammar of the language, the description of the properties of the language. An adequate grammar must, at the very least, provide a recursive enumeration of the grammatical sentences of the language and their structures. That must be what's technically called a generative grammar. Beyond that, it must yield what's been called the basic property of language, a digital infinity of hierarchically structured expressions, each of which determines or perhaps constitutes a thought, each of which can optionally be externalized in some sensory motor medium. That's the minimum condition on an acceptable description. Well, a bold thesis would be that the generation of thought by the internal language is separated from externalization, which is an ancillary process. I'll assume this here. I'll return to reasons why I think it's correct. In this conception, the internal language consists of the compositional rules that satisfy the basic property, along with what's called formal semantics, more accurately called logical syntax. That's an interesting matter I'll put aside. One version that fits closely with the theoretical framework I'll be outlining here is the kind of neo-Davidsonian event semantics developed most extensively by Paul Petrosky, Barry Shine. Well, the system for generating thought we can call I language. I stands for internal individual and intentional. Intentional with an S, this is sometimes misunderstood, means that we're interested in the actual system coded in the brain, not with one that yields the same output. Well, understood in this way, the study of language conforms to a long tradition from classical Greece and India through the 19th century. Throughout, the core of the tradition regarded language as fundamentally a system of thought, audible thought, in the phrase of 19th century linguist William Dwight Whitney, though we now know that restriction to sound is too narrow, any sensory motor system can do. Well, that millennia-long tradition was swept aside in the 20th century by behaviorist, structuralist approaches, and the rich tradition was forgotten. These approaches to language, 20th century ones, take language to be at its root a system of communication, not a system of thought, as in the tradition. Very different, and perhaps evolved from animal communication. More recent work, the kind I'll be discussing, seems to me to provide strong evidence that the tradition was on the right track and should be carried forward. That's a controversial view today, but I think it's justified. I'll adopt it here. Well, returning to explanation, the task arrives at the higher level, inquiry into faculty of language. FL must at least explain how a language is acquired. It appears to be the case that any human infant can acquire any language with comparable facility. And there is now substantial evidence that FL is unique to humans. That is, its fundamental properties have no analog elsewhere in the animal world. If these assumptions are correct, as seems to be the case, then FL is a true species property, shared by humans, unique to them in essentials. And I'll also assume that in what proceeds. Well, FL must at least provide an explanation of how any human infant can acquire any language. It's a condition that's sometimes been called explanatory adequacy since the 1950s. Sometimes it's called Plato's problem, as that was formulated by Bertrand Russell. It's the problem of how we can know so much with so little evidence. In linguistics, it's been called the problem of poverty of stimulus. Well, in the early days of the generative enterprise in mid-20th century, it was recognized that this poverty of stimulus problem was quite serious, and that standard formulations within behaviorist frameworks will get nowhere, much like their contemporary variants and coming from Silicon Valley. These early conclusions were established more firmly as serious experimental inquiry was undertaken into child language acquisition. It was found that the poverty of stimulus problems are far more severe than had been assumed. By now, it's quite solidly established that the knowledge of language of a 2 to 3-year-old child goes far beyond what they exhibit in behavior, and also that the gap between data available and knowledge attained is vast. That greatly deepens Plato's problem. Well, these results seem to suggest that the faculty of language must be quite rich to yield complex knowledge from impoverished data, while at the same time, the faculty of language must somehow accommodate the wide variety of languages. That's a problem. That problem deepens when we turn to another condition that the faculty of language must satisfy, sometimes called Darwin's problem. How can FL have evolved under the conditions of human evolution? Though evidence is fragmentary, there are some quite plausible conclusions about these conditions. Modern humans appeared roughly 200 to 300,000 years ago. There is now genomic evidence that the small group of humans began to separate about 150,000 years ago. They all share the faculty of language, which therefore must have been in place. Well, prior to the appearance of modern humans, there's virtually no evidence of significant symbolic activity in the archaeological record. Not long after their appearance, there is very rich evidence. Notice that these numbers they sound large, but they're barely a flick of an eye in evolutionary time. Well, all of this suggests that the faculty of language appeared in a very narrow window of time, pretty much along with modern humans, and hasn't changed since. Well, if so, we would expect the faculty of language to be very simple. So it emerged so suddenly and completely not changing. So we therefore face a conundrum. FL must be rich enough to handle Plato's problem, at the same time must be simple enough to deal with Darwin's problem. And the apparent wide diversity of languages, all determined by FL, lurks in the background. That's a conundrum. These are the basic conditions that must be satisfied by a theory of the faculty of language, what's called universal grammar in contemporary usage. That's adapting a traditional term to a new context. The conditions appear to be contradictory. Much of the search for explanatory theory in past years has been guided by the apparent contradiction. For the first time, I think we can now begin to see how the conundrum might be resolved. If so, that's a highly significant moment in the millennia-old study of language. Let's turn to that. So let's begin with the problem of diversity. That problem would be greatly reduced if diversity of language is sequestered in a particular component of the overall system. The natural place to look is in externalization, excluding the I language operations that yield the thought system. But that move has initial plausibility. For I language, the poverty of stimulus problems are overwhelming, generally completely insurmountable. For externalization, at least there is direct evidence, what is heard or seen. Though this hasn't been firmly established, research has been tending towards showing that the variety, complexity, easy mutability of language is indeed sequestered in externalization. That leaves generation of thought relatively fixed, maybe even completely fixed. We might someday discover that would vindicate an ancient tradition. Well, if this turns out to be true for language, it would not be very surprising. Externalization is not, strictly speaking, language. Rather, it is an amalgam of the internal system for generation of thought and sensory motor systems that have nothing to do with language and were in place long before language appeared and haven't been affected by language. We might expect then that mapping the internal language into completely unrelated sensory motor systems would be a complex task, solvable in many ways, easily subject to at least superficial change. And that seems to be the case. Well, if that's the case, we then face the poverty of stimulus problems for externalization. This has been the subject of extensive research since the principles and parameters framework was formulated about 40 years ago. It was the first approach that offered at least a potential framework for accounting for acquisition in a feasible manner. Very important work, primarily by the late Ken Hale and his students, close friend and colleague. That work has shown that languages that appear to be radically different are actually cast to the same mold at deeper levels. One high point in this research was Mark Baker's work on hierarchy of parameters. Major step forward was later taken by Ian Roberts, Cambridge University, who's shown quite persuasively how very simple algorithms based on elementary cognitive principles can feasibly zero in to the choice of parameters that determine an externalization system. He's tested this on thousands of languages of great typological variety. David Lightfoot has developed a promising approach from a somewhat different point of view. I think we can say that the basic problem of variety of externalization systems is fairly well in hand. And if externalization is the primary, maybe only locus of variation, a large part of the problem is on its way to resolution, variety, and learnability. I should make a side comment on learnability, which is commonly misunderstood. To say that something is learned is almost vacuous until we are told how it was acquired. If you think about it, there's a spectrum of development of the organism from some initial state to a relatively stable final state. At one extreme of this spectrum, we have what we call growth. Nutrition is required for an embryo to develop into a cat or a human, but the course of the development is overwhelmingly internally determined. At the other end of the spectrum, you have something like parameter setting. So English is an SVO rather than an SOV language, or arbitrariness of pronunciation. So the sound cat means cat. What happens at that end of the spectrum is called learning, paradigm examples of learning. But that tells us very little. Even such simple cases of learning are in fact an amalgam of rich internal structure, which sets a very narrow range of options and some external data. Remarkably little external data, as has been shown by experimental work, primarily that of the late Liebig-Leitman, careful statistical analysis by Charles Yang, who reveals the sparsity of data available to the infant when we do close statistical analysis. Considerations like these should be kept in mind when we hear loose talk about what is learned. Well, to proceed beyond, let's turn to some concrete examples, beginning with the most fundamental property of human language, one that is quite surprising in many ways and has rich consequences that are not always sufficiently appreciated. I'm referring to the property called structure dependence. So for concreteness, let's turn to some simple cases. So begin with the operation of construal. For example, modification of a verb phrase by an adverb. So take the sentence, the man who fixed the car carefully packed his tools. That's ambiguous. He could have fixed the car carefully or carefully packed his tools. Now put the adverb in the front. Carefully, the man who fixed the car packed the tools. That's unambiguous. Means he carefully packed the tools. Actually, that's a puzzle. The adverb in initial position has to find a verb phrase to modify, but we ignore the simplest computation. Find the closest verb phrase. That would be fix the car. We reflexively ignore this and choose the more remote verb phrase, packed his tools. It's clear why, if you think about the structure of the sentence. The phrase packed his tools is closer to the adverb than fix the car in the abstract structure, which is what we attend to, though we never hear it. There's more involved, but that's enough to bring out the basic puzzle. We ignore the simple computation on linear order of words and reflexively carry out a computation on abstract structure. That's an instance of structure dependence. Well, take another example, anaphors. The simplest algorithm is to seek the closest eligible antecedent. So if I say that the boys expect the girls to like each other, it's the girls who like each other, not the boys. But sometimes that fails, as in the sentence, the friends of the boys like each other. Here it's the friends who like each other, not the boys. Once again, reflexively, we ignore the simplest algorithm, which relies on what we hear, words in linear order, and we use an algorithm that applies to abstract structures and is in fact fairly complex. First, identify the subject noun phrase, then the head, the core element within the noun phrase, choose that as the antecedent. Well, take one last example, verbal agreement. So the bombing of the cities is a crime, not or a crime. The bombings of the city are a crime, not is a crime. Reflexively, we ignore the simplest operation, adjacency, and again, carry out an operation that looks quite complex. Construct the abstract structure, subject, predicate, locate the head of that structure. Well, these observations generalize. Structure dependence holds of all constructions in all I languages. That means that from infancy and on through life, we reflexively ignore 100% of what we hear, words in linear order, and we attend only to what we never hear, abstract structures generated by the mind and operations on these structures. And furthermore, experimental work has shown that the principle is known to children as early as they can be tested, even earlier than 2 years old. Notice that this curious property is restricted to I language. generation of thought. Doesn't hold for externalization. There you use operations based on linear order, what you hear. Well, there's only one plausible conclusion. I language and externalization are distinct systems. For I language, efficient computation ignores what's externalized. Furthermore, all of this must be part of the innately fixed faculty of language, property of UG. That conclusion further supports the thesis that I language, that is language proper, is a system of generation of thought, as was assumed in the millennia-old tradition prior to the behaviorist structuralist revision in the 20th century. Well, it's plain why languages use linear order for externalization. It's required by the speech organs, which cannot produce structures. In fact, sign language, with the resources of visual space available, doesn't adhere strictly to linearization. Recall that the sensory motor organs used for externalization are completely unrelated to language in their nature and evolution. So it's not surprising that I language, pure language, ignores the properties imposed by these non-linguistic organs. Well, with this in mind, we can turn to the why questions. Why does UG force structure dependence? The optimal answer to that would be that this follows from the simplest possible form of UG, using the simplest operation for generating expressions. The simplest operation is unbounded binary set formation, what's called merge in the current literature. And in fact, it's possible to show that structure dependence does follow directly from merge. A language that doesn't satisfy structure dependence is an impossible language. To put it metaphorically, when Mother Nature created language, she found the simplest possible solution, which is, incidentally, the way evolution works generally. That's an instance of what Einstein called the miracle creed, tracing back to Leibniz's principle of least effort. Miraculously, whatever comes to be understood, science has converged on Galileo's dictum that nature is simple and it's the task of science, the scientist, to show it. There's no reason to expect language to be different. And increasingly, we are, I think, beginning to approach that ideal, the miracle creed, along with the rest of science. Fundamental case of structure dependence is one example of that. And it has a striking consequence. Children ignore everything they hear 100%. Pay attention only to what they never hear, and their minds construct abstract structures. Well, reliance on merge as the sole structure building operation has many other crucial empirical consequences. I'll only be able to sketch a few. First, reliance on merge as the sole structure building operation yields the core of the basic property, generating an infinite array of hierarchically structured expressions. We need only add that the primitive elements of the system are elementary concepts. When these are elaborated by merge, they become phrases. Translating straightforwardly to event semantics, these phrases would be the syntactic exponents of participants in events, agent, theme, goal, so on. A program along these lines, if it can be fully carried out, would complete the theory of generation of thought, leaving externalization as an ancillary system, one that has quite interesting properties, in part determined by the abstract eye language structures that it maps to the sensory motor system. I should add that the evolutionary origin of the most elementary concepts that serve as primitives is a complete mystery. They have no analogs in the rest of the animal world, and of course there's no record of their development. So that may be an unanswerable mystery. Well, there are two logical possibilities for merge of X and Y. Either the two are distinct, or one is a term and the other. The term here means a term A is a term of B if it's a member of B, these are sets, or a member of B, so it's recursive. These two options are called external and internal merge, respectively. External merge yields combination, as in read books. Internal merge yields displacement, as in which books did he read, where which books is understood to be the object of read. In the past, it's been assumed by me in particular that combination by external merge is the expected natural operation, and that displacement, while it's ubiquitous in language, is an anomaly, an imperfection that has to be explained away somehow. That turns out to be a mistake. In fact, it's internal merge, displacement, that is the preferred operation, requires far less search than external merge. The real question is why language ever resorts to external merge. The answer lies in the fact that eye language generates thought. It must therefore provide structures in which semantic roles are determined. It's called theta theory in the literature. It takes a little bit of work, but it can be shown that this can only be done by external merge. Therefore, both displacement and combination will appear in an optimal system. Two categories of merge. Well, one general property of computation, a defining property for any computation, is that symbols don't change interpretation in the course of computation. Call that principle preservation. The most extreme violation of preservation would be total disappearance. Therefore, merge must never erase elements. So if you want to generate which books did you read, internal merge, the in eye language will yield which books did you read, which books. That's interpreted directly as for which books X you read the books X. Merge, therefore, automatically yields the phenomenon of displacement with reconstruction, a topic that's been extensively studied, but there's basically nothing to say about it. It falls out directly from the optimal system of generation, just as structure dependence does. What reaches our mind in this case is which books did you read, which books? What reaches the ear and reaches consciousness is which books did you read? Externalization removes all but one occurrence. One has to remain to indicate that the operation took place. That's a very general economy condition. Radically reduces mental computation and execution of articulatory motions. Notice that what's called inner speech, what you say to yourself, basically, that's actually externalized speech. In fact, if you look closely, it's fragments of externalized speech. What's going on in our minds is not accessible to consciousness, just as we have no conscious insight into the workings of other parts of our body. We can study them only from the outside, from what philosophers call a third-person perspective. The mind is much like other organic systems in this respect. Notice that the results of these operations are to maximize computational efficiency while yielding serious problems for perception and parsing, what are called filler gap problems. Hard problems, the hardest ones, in fact. The parser or perceiver finds a WH phrase, like which books, and then it has to find the gap that it fills for interpretation. That turns out to be quite complex. Maybe the main problem in automatic parsing. The problem would be radically reduced if the gap were filled, but Mother Nature didn't care about that when designing language. She insisted on finding the most elegant solution, even though it poses difficulties for language use, quite serious ones as sentences become more complex. This is one of many cases in which computational efficiency conflicts with communicative efficiency. Invariably, communicative efficiency is sacrificed. That's more evidence for the traditional conception of language as fundamentally a system of thought used for communication and much else, but these are incidental properties. All of this is consistent with how evolution works quite generally. Schematically, we can distinguish three phases, three stages of evolution. First, some accidental disruption takes place, maybe a mutation or gene transfer, or one bacterium swallowing another microorganism. That's the breakthrough that led to complex cells, complex organisms. The second stage is reconstruction. Nature reconstructs the new entity in the simplest way, paying no attention to how it might be used. The third stage is winnowing. The outcomes that reproduce more effectively prevail. That's natural selection. Well, that suggests a reasonable scenario for language evolution. First, some minor rewiring of the brain took place, yielding the new property of recursive enumeration. Next step is reconstruction. Nature devises the simplest, most elegant way to organize the new system. Theta theory becomes available, possibly has more primitive origins. The computational principles are given. They're basically part of natural law. The winnowing stage is never reached. No natural selection in language evolution, possibly because of lack of time. It's only a couple 100,000 years. And possibly more interestingly, because the optimal system is so delicately designed that it's either all or none. You can't change any part of it or it all collapses. That actually might be the case, so recent work suggests. And if it is, it's quite an interesting result of general significance. Well, we're approaching a very interesting conclusion. I language might be perfect and a common human possession. That was actually proposed 25 years ago. It's called the strong minimalist thesis, SMT. It was not then regarded as a realistic proposal, rather a long-term goal that might guide research. Recent work suggests something more audacious. The thesis might indeed be true, as evolutionary theory leads us to expect, and as empirical inquiry increasingly suggests. There's a great deal of further evidence for these conclusions. I'll just take one last case. Consider the distinction between what used to be called trace and pro, capital P-R-O. It's keeping the earlier terminology now abandoned. So the distinction is illustrated by sentences such as these. Take one interpreter each seems to be assigned to the visitors. One interpreter each tried to be assigned to the visitors. Both sentences are fine if you don't have each, but the second one with try is barred with each present. You can't say one interpreter each tried to be assigned to the visitors. So why is that? Well, actually follows from simplest merge. The good sentence with seems is generated by internal merge. Therefore, what appears in what used to be called the trace position is actually one interpreter each, as in one interpreter each was assigned to the visitors, which is fine. But I am internal merge cannot generate the sentence with try, where each is barred. And there's a very good reason for that. Preservation, a general condition on valid computation. So a particular inscription cannot change an interpretation in the course of computation. It follows that internal merge cannot move a term into a theta position where a semantic role is defined, like the subject of try, that would change its interpretation. That position must be filled by external merge of an element that had no prior theta role. Internal merge, however, can move an object to the subject of seeing where no theta role is assigned, as in one interpreter each seems to be assigned to the visitors, automatically yielding reconstruction. Well, a little thought will show that these considerations suffice to yield the entire system of obligatory control, both subject and object control. It's a module of I language. Well, at this point, new questions arise. Why does the module of control exist with its complicated properties? We now have an answer. I language satisfies SMT, and language uses all the options it provides. Otherwise, there would be no reason for language to have such systems as subject and object control, along with others that are established on the same grounds. Reversing the reasoning, the existence of these systems provides evidence that language observes the strong minimalist thesis. No time to go into the details here, but a number of other modules fall into place in a similar manner, including problems that have resisted even description, let alone explanation, in the past. Two examples are head raising and sequences. Head raising is constantly used in linguistic descriptions, but illegitimately. There is no such operation within any existing framework. This reason is discussed elsewhere. And it turns out to be dispensable within the framework I'm outlining, the SMT framework. What about sequences? They've been a hopeless problem since the earliest days of explicit grammar. So take a simple sentence like, Tom, Dick, and Harry danced and sang all night. Both the subject and the verb phrase sequences can extend without limit. Within phrase structure grammar, that would require infinitely many rules. Impossible. Transformations don't help, nor do any other mechanisms that have been proposed. The meaning of such expressions also raises questions. So take the sentence, Tom, Dick, and Harry danced and sang all night. That accommodates many different thoughts. Maybe Tom and Dick danced and Harry sang, or maybe lots of other things. And the interpretation is not sequential. The interpretation becomes sequential only when the subject and the verb phrase have the same number of conjuncts and a phrase such as respectively is added. But contrary to what I assumed in the past, that's a discourse property. It's not a property of I language. So for example, we can say Tom, Dick, and Harry are close friends. They even co-author articles. They teach at Harvard, Oxford, and Peking University, respectively. That's a discourse property. It's therefore unnecessary to add a rule form sequence, as was done in earlier work of mine. For I language, we can just keep to set formation. That's an operation that comes free. Any system's going to have set formation. That same analysis extends without change to other kinds of apparent sequences, like they proceeded step by step by step, lie after lie, as eroded the concept of truth, and so on. The array of associated properties discussed in recent literature follows at once. The sets are externalized as sequences for the usual reasons. The non-language sensory motor systems require, well, crucially, I language keeps to SMT throughout in these cases, no departure necessary, both for what appear as sequences and for the amalgamation of heads that replaces the impossible operation of head movement. Well, it remains to see how far we can extend such reasoning. Needless to say, that's an extremely challenging task. Nothing like it has ever risen in the study of language and thought. There are promising early steps, far beyond what could have been imagined only a few years ago. SMT finally has several functions. One is a disciplinary function. It sharply restricts the options for description and thus deepens explanation. Fewer options, deeper explanation. It also has an enabling function. It provides options for what I language might be, for what modules might exist. And a very interesting question, which we can now formulate for the first time, is to explore whether I languages make use of all the possibilities enabled by SMT, which might be more than a general guideline for inquiry, as was assumed in the past, but might actually express a fundamental truth about the nature of language and thought, which are the most distinctive possessions of this strange species that we belong to. I'll stop there and turn, if we have time, to some of the questions that were raised. Okay. I don't know if you have them or can put them up there, or shall I read them?
Hi, Noam. Would you like to have a 5 minutes break or just we go on? Can we just
Shall
go
I-
on, or would you like a short break?
Sorry, I don't see.
Okay, go on with the discussion. Okay.
Oh, I see.
Hi, Noam. Can you hear me?
The questions in the chat
Okay,
box.
questions.
Oh, okay, good.
Hi, Selena, can you see the screen?
Yes. The question PowerPoint.
Okay, good morning. This is the Innovation in Linguistics organized by the journal Cognitive Semantics. We are very fortunate today to have Professor Noam Chomsky. Now, the following are the selected questions. So we have balanced a few factors, including questions from the journal and questions from the audience, questions from professors, questions from the audience, questions for the very technical ones, and a question for common ones. Now let's go on from the first one. Okay, Professor Chomsky, I read the first question to you. Does universal grammar include any universals of semantics? So they are simple questions, but the questions themselves are not very simple. So you can either elaborate or give a short answer.
I think it's worth to elaborate. I won't be too long. First
Okay.
question that has to be asked, clarified, is what's meant by semantics? There is a technical sense of semantics, the sense of Frege, Tarski, Carnap, Quine, and so on. In that sense, that sense is based on the notion of reference and truth. And in fact, language has no such semantics. There is no such. There's extensive discussion of this elsewhere. I can go into it. So that leaves us only with another sense of semantics, the general theory of meaning, whatever that is. Anything that can be discovered about it is going to be part of universal grammar. In fact, generative grammars already do yield semantic properties. For example, the ones I discussed, like the pro-trace examples, or to take another case, which I didn't mention, take the sentence, many books were stolen from the library. Compare that with many books are easy to steal from the library. They have different meanings. Many books were stolen from the library just means there's a thief around. Many books are easy to steal from the library, refers to some specific category of books, maybe biographies. Why are they different? Can't go on to give the explanation now, but it follows from optimal merge and the property of preservation. Well, let's turn to the next. So I think, yes, universal grammar includes whatever universals there are of semantics, and in fact, it yields many of them, like these.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chomsky. Second one. What does generative grammar propose about theories of cognition? Thank you.
Well, that's a strange question in many ways. Suppose I was to ask what the theories of visual perception propose about theories of cognition. Well, the answer is that theories of visual perception are theories of cognition, like core theories. Same with generative grammar. It's a theory of cognition. In fact, a core theory of cognition deals with the nature of thought, core property of cognition. And generative grammar is the theory of thought, basically. It's the generative grammars are the systems that construct thoughts. Thoughts are what are constructed by the grammars. That's the tradition. I think it's basically correct.
Can I understand in this way, generative grammar itself is the theory of cognition? Thank you, Professor Chomsky. Let's go to the next one. What aspect of language does universal grammar not address well?
Well, to begin with, there are innumerable properties of language that haven't been explained. Explanation is a project that is barely beginning. Until a few years ago, there were no genuine explanations, no explanations that satisfied Plato's and Darwin's problem and the problem of variation. Only in the last few years are there any explanations at all. So what remains unexplained? Almost everything. Project's just beginning. There are certain mysteries that we're probably not going to be able to explain. One of them I mentioned, the origin of human concepts. There is no analog elsewhere in the animal world, so nothing to compare it with. And we have no records. So it's one of those many questions which simply may not be answerable. But there are other mysteries that are deeper than that, where we can't even imagine an answer, very old ones, in fact. So take production of language. Production of language, the early modern scientific revolution, 17th century, Galileo and his colleagues expressed their awe and amazement at what they took to be one of the most remarkable things in the world. And I think they were right. How is it possible for humans alone, with a finite number of symbols, small number of symbols, to create infinitely many thoughts? And secondarily, even to find a way to convey to others who have no access to their minds, the inner workings of our minds. That's the first part of that. How can we create infinitely many thoughts? That part we can now begin to answer with generative grammar. The second part, but that's not enough for production. Production requires two stages. First stage, you have to pick out of the infinite number of thoughts one and try to express that one. Second part is implementing the expression of it once you've picked it out. The second part you can study. There is work on production, Tim Levelt's work, for example. The first part we can say nothing about. No one has any idea how you pick out one of the infinite set of thoughts and then use it appropriately in situations. That's a total mystery. That's basically Descartes' problem. It's the fundamental reason why he postulated mind as a separate entity. This was a large part of the reason. We have no explanation for it. In fact, more broadly, we have no explanation for any kind of voluntary action. So if I lift my finger, nobody can explain how I decided to lift my finger, even trivial things like that. When you talk about producing a thought, it's infinitely more difficult than you can say essentially nothing. It may well be one of those questions that's simply not within the framework of a human intelligence. Maybe it lies beyond human intelligence, we don't know. But there are plenty of problems and mysteries to solve.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. Number 4. Now, how does generative grammar see the relation between structure in grammar and structure? Hi, Selena, I can't see, it is, you can.
Generative grammar should include both. It also anticipates that grammatical structure will be a factor in the structure of meaning, as, for example, in the cases that I mentioned. So they're both topics of generative grammar.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Save some trouble. There is a series of questions now that followed about int, int, but actually there's a misunderstanding that should be cleared up. Int is just an expository device. It's a way of saying things in a simple manner. It's not part of language or the theory of language. It's just a convenient way to lay out the options at a particular stage of formalization. So in a true formalization, there won't be any more serious problem, which is commonly misunderstood all over the literature. It's necessary to distinguish generation from production. They are very different things. Generation is what Aristotle called possession of knowledge. Competence, it's called these days. Production is what Aristotle called use of knowledge, one kind of performance. In a formal system, generation produces an infinite array, say an axiom system. The generation process constructs an infinite array of well-formed formulas or of proofs, which are basically certain geometrical objects. It says, here's the infinite set. It says nothing about how to construct a well-formed formula or how to construct a proof. That's a creative act, which we don't understand. In the generative system for language, there's no such thing as, quoting from one of the questions, trial cost to reach one's specified desired utterance. Just as in an axiom system, there's no specified desired proof. The questions don't arise within generation. And the same is true for this series of questions. So to get to one of the later ones, int is not used. It's informal. It's an expository device to lay out the options for the next step of derivation. I think we can go on to a question about adding features.
Yeah. Okay, the following question will be read by the assistant of the journal, Cognitive Semantics. Selena?
Okay, this question goes like, why is agreement marking like subject-verb agreement needed in languages? It seems to be redundant on the one hand and is not universally seen. Thank you, Professor Chomsky.
It's a very good question. One to which there ought to be an answer, but nobody knows. First of all, there's pretty good reason to believe that there is agreement even when it doesn't show up phonetically. Chinese, for example. It seems to function, but why? It seems as if language could get by perfectly well without unvalued features, but there's good evidence that they're there. So that's a very interesting question. There have been proposals. So one proposal was that the unvalued features are there to mark phases. You need phases are the units that are constructed and sent off for interpretation for very strong economy reasons, but doesn't seem to work very well. So at the moment, it's an unanswered question. Now you can say the same thing about structural case. Why does language have structural case? Sometimes manifested, sometimes implicit. Doesn't feature, doesn't function in semantic interpretation, conceptual, intentional interface. So why is it there? Nobody has a really good answer. It's one of those problems that remains to be solved. Notice that questions like this didn't even arise until very recently in the whole history of linguistics. Several million years, I don't think these questions have ever been raised seriously. Now we have to raise them because we're trying to find explanations.
Okay, the question was read from Singapore. Now the next one.
Sorry, I can't.
Hi, Dr. Du.
I see. What is the relation between merge and labeling? Well, you go back about 25 years when this work was just beginning, labeling and merge were unified. So merge was defined in a more complex way. So merge and say merge of read and the book gave the set label, verb, read, and the book, a three-membered set. That turned out to be wrong. Number of people, Chris Collins, Dan Seeley and others pointed out that labeling is independent of merge. So the more recent work of maybe the last 15 years or so assumes that merge just applies freely. And then there's an independent labeling algorithm which operates on a general computational principle of minimal search. Now there's a discussion of this in a paper of mine about 10 years ago in Lingua on problems of projection. And this is related to another problem. X-bar theory, which replaced phrase structure grammar about 50 years ago. X-bar theory made a lot of progress, but it also introduced some new problems. So X-bar theory is necessarily endocentric. Each unit that's created is projection of a head. But there's plenty of things in language which are simply not endocentric, exocentric construction. Subject predicate, for example. Every result of internal merge, they're all exocentric. Well, the way that was dealt with was by cheating, essentially. So subject predicate was described as basically verbal, although the theory, X-bar theory, didn't tell you that. It said it could just as well be nominal. Verbal was picked because it made some sense, but not because it was legitimate. The more recent theories, those of the last 10 years, have expanded to deal with exocentric constructions and give a different approach to this question. But I think they should be separated, distinguished. Merge is one kind of thing, labeling is another.
Thank you, Professor. Next question will be read to you from Europe.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. The next question is, it is suggested that language serves as a cornerstone for human cognition. Then, how does language ability affect other cognitive functions in both evolution and development? What components of language may play a key role in human cognition? Thank you.
Well, again, language is a cornerstone of human cognition. We don't really know much about evolution of cognitive capacities. Very little is understood about that. Actually, there's a famous article that's worth reading if you haven't read it, by a very distinguished evolutionary biologist, Richard Lewontin. The article appears in the multi-volume set Invitation to Cognitive Science, published at MIT. It contains many important articles about cognitive science. Lewontin was assigned the topic evolution of human cognition, and he runs carefully through the modes of inquiry that are available to evolutionary biologists. And he points out that essentially none of these tell you anything about evolution of cognition, and partly simply because we don't have records. The only records you have are fossils and things created by humans, tools and so on. They just don't tell you much about how human cognition evolved. So you can imagine reasonably that human cognition could develop and is used only on the basis of thinking. You have to have thoughts to determine what you're doing, what to try, what the alternatives are, what the possibilities might be, and so on. So in that sense, it's almost close to tautological that language and thought, which may functions, at least in development and use, probably in evolution.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chomsky. Let's go back to Singapore.
This question goes like, could you please explain your current view of the lexicon? Is it structured or stratified in a way similar to Kaspersky's hypothesis of lexical phonology and morphology? Or does it merely serve as a set of static lists? So what is the boundary of the explanations of your linguistics theories? Thank you.
Well, that depends, first of all, on what we mean by the lexicon. If the lexicon is taken to be the minimal functioning elements, what are sometimes called formatives, then by definition, it's a list because they have no structure. But what's usually meant by the lexicon is the atoms of computation, the things that are acted on by the computational system to construct larger structures. So, for example, the word performative would be in the lexicon, a single element, but it's obviously constructed. Now here, and that's true of almost all but the very simplest words, not words, but elements, because they're not necessarily words. Like an idiom can be a lexical item. And the question then is, how are they constructed? Well, there are various approaches. The one that seems to me a reasonable one has been developed by Alec Morantz, Richard Kane, Chris Collins, recent papers, which tried, Mark Aronoff also, tried to show that the lexicon is constructed, again, by the operation of merge with some extra constraints. there are other approaches. This is a lively research area, which hasn't settled into place yet, I don't think.
Okay, for the next questions, we go back to Beijing.
So this question goes like this. In terms of the rapid development of AI, what do you think of the future of linguistics?
Well, as I sort of indicated in my talk, my own feeling is that AI has developed backwards. If you go to the early stages of AI, Alan Turing, Herb Simon, Marv Minsky, they regarded artificial intelligence as a theory of intelligence, a scientific approach to the nature of intelligence. That's part of science. In fact, it's no different from, it's just cognitive science. It's the part of cognitive science that uses particular models to try as tools of inquiry, programming computers for a means of inquiring into the nature of intelligence. That part of AI has been pretty much forgotten. By now, AI is almost purely an engineering discipline, tries to construct useful things, and sometimes does a very good job. It's often very clever engineering. So, in fact, I'm using it right now. When you and I are reading the transcript, we're benefiting from very clever engineering, using enormous quantities of data, supercomputers, studying the data to try to find patterns, superficial patterns, and out of that, reaching some useful device. But that has nothing to do with science. And it's like building a better bulldozer. And that's now pretty much what AI is. So I don't think it, in its current stage, it can do, sometimes the things it produces just are totally pointless, like the ones I described. Say GPT, the GPT series, or Google's Lambda, the one that's big fuss now. I don't see any point to them at all. What's the point of a system that can match 45 things in 45 terabytes of data and make you think you're listening to something real? That's a game. But as long as AI is following that direction, it may be useful for linguistics. Like maybe it can study huge amounts of data and find properties that weren't noticed, something like that. It could be a good tool, but again, it's an engineering result. And in other areas, it also does interesting things, like by studying enormous number of ways in which proteins can fold. AI methods have partially answered some very interesting questions of molecular biology about protein folding, other things like that. AI is going to have a major impact on linguistics for another reason. That's where the money is. That's where the jobs are. If you're coming out of a linguistics program and you want to study scientific questions, those that'll tell you something about the nature of language, it's not easy to get a job. It's not easy to get a grant. If you have a proposal to improve GT4 to GT7, you can get paid for it and you get a job. It's contributing nothing but except some engineering applications. I myself hope that AI will return to its early days, the days of Turing, Minsky, Simon, McCarthy, others who were interested in scientific questions, but that's mostly been marginalized.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. Back to Singapore.
Back to Europe, actually.
Determines, dictates the choice of merge mates. Would that acknowledge the crucial decisive influence semantics has on syntax, which then seems trivialized? Well, remember, int does nothing. Int is an expository device that is a way of expressing the fact that in generation, at a particular stage, here's the set of options that are available. It's like the rules of formation of a formal system. You've generated certain structure, here's what you can do next. In formalizing the system, there would be no int. And there's no choice of merge mates. It's just anything you want. It just as in an axiom system, there's no choice of what the next line of a proof will be. I mean, you can make that choice, the person, when you're aiming at something, but the system doesn't make it. So there's no, the only influence semantics has on, first of all, semantics is syntax. That's certainly true of what's called formal semantics, like model theoretic semantics, or even event semantics. Those are syntax. They are, that's why I said they should be called logical syntax. What they are symbolic manipulations. By definition, that's syntax. To make it semantics, you have to have some relationship to the outside world. And those relationships are mainly just hand waving. Yeah, I can look at a cat and say that's a cat, but that doesn't tell me what the meaning of cat is. Turns out the meaning of cat is extremely complex when you look into it. Infants just know it reflexively from some basis that we don't understand. But the parts of semantics that anybody does anything with are essentially symbol manipulation. They work the same way if there's no world at all. So that's syntax. So to get to the question, int, we can forget. It's an expository device only. In true formalization, there won't be any such thing. And there's no real semantics, authentic semantics, either doesn't exist in language, like the reference relation. Notice the act of referring is an action, but that doesn't tell you that there's a relation of reference between the words you're using, sentences you're using, and something in the mind external world. That's a different question, not one that no field deals with. So I don't think that this question really arises when we are clear about the distinction between generation and production, possession of knowledge and use of knowledge in Aristotle's terms. And about the latter, use of knowledge, there's not very much to say. Some interesting things, like John Austin's study of speech acts, or Paul Grice's study of presuppositions. It's interesting, but it doesn't affect its use of language. Interesting study of how language is used. Doesn't say anything about its design.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. Next one.
This is the last but the second question. Could there be cases where syntax really cannot fulfill int's orders? If yes, how are the merge mates chosen? Thank you.
Well, this is the same problem. Merge mates are chosen in use of language, in production. Nobody has any idea how. The syntax doesn't fulfill int's orders because there aren't any. Int just is a way of, an informal way of saying, here are the options when you've reached this point in generation, like the rules of formation of for say propositional calculus, or like an axiom system for arithmetic. Says you've reached this stage, here's the possible next stages. Then comes the choice which is made by the mathematician or the speaker of language, and nobody has any idea how that takes place.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. Next question.
Okay, this is the last question. Why is form sequence a de-hierarchizing operation rather than a compositional one? Wouldn't it violate the no tampering condition?
What would it add? It add to violate the no tampering condition would be violating the SMT. It would be violating the principle that language is the simplest possible system. Maybe it isn't the simplest possible system. Well, in that case, too bad. As in physics or biology or any other field, you're trying to show that nature picked the simplest system. As I said, that's been demonstrated over the centuries to be true to such an astonishing extent that it's now what Einstein called the miracle creed. Always works out as soon as we understand something. So what we try to show is that language is like that. If it turns out that it isn't, that you have to violate the no tampering condition, well, too bad. Nature did a bad job. Could happen, but the goal of science is to show as much as possible what Galileo called science, the study of how nature is simple, and it's our task to show it. If that's wrong, tough luck.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. That's all the questions. And thank you very much. Hi, Selina, I give you the microphone.
Okay, so thank you, Noam, on behalf of all of us here in Zoom and the others on the other venue. And thank you for your time. We hope to see you next time on a similar or related topic. Thank you for your support to cognitive semantics. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
My pleasure to be with you.